Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman. And today on Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, we have an exciting episode because we're going to be talking about the royals. We're going to be talking about Harry's brand new book that came out that is breaking boundaries, we'll say, when it comes to book sales, and also with regards to bringing out an important message concerning estrangement. So I think this is an important topic, especially for our audience. So thank you so much for being here, Fern. It's great to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here. And what unusual times. Sibling estrangement has been so stigmatized throughout the decades. And suddenly Harry comes along and changes everything. I'm not a big fan of the monarchy, but this week I'm a very big fan of Harry. His book Spare, which is this hotly anticipated memoir about his life, is probably one of the biggest selling books ever. On its first day of publication, it sold over 1.5 million copies, and that's both in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom. The publishing houses actually had to go back and reprint this title. They're already out of copies, and the first printing was over 2 million. The reason I identify all of these numbers is imagine what this is going to do for sibling estrangement and the stigma of sibling estrangement.
You're absolutely right. I think that this is so important in terms of what this is helping to promote in terms of the conversations that need to be had, and I can just imagine Harry's torment with regards to this. The idea of having to somehow bring this out, somehow having to, somehow deal with his feelings that were building and building and building in terms of what he was experiencing, and a lot of times, we're walking in silence with a lot of this, when we're experiencing estrangement and such. And, it's this type of torment that we all hold within ourselves, until we start to speak up and denounce it. And that's exactly what Harry did. He got to that point where he got fed up, and it started building and building and building. And eventually, he just basically decided to up and leave, and I think that that was especially important that he be able to do that, because sometimes that's the only thing that you can do sometimes, setting boundaries does imply sometimes having to take your body elsewhere.
I actually got a call from BBC a while ago, and they wanted me to talk about that series, that the new Harry and Meghan series. So I spent an afternoon watching it, and one of the big takeaways is that he is going to have his life the way he wants it, regardless of what his family and the monarchy do. And it was rather inspiring in that way, that he was willing to forfeit everything for this. And I think there's such a strong need and drive to be true to yourself.
The message we've been sending our community has been constantly about journeying and finding yourself, right? It's about being able to reclaim yourself outside of a system that's toxic, and there's so many elements in the particular monarchy that is toxic, because if we can look at some of those elements that we can perhaps name briefly, but you can see how it's necessary for us to pick ourselves up and to establish meaning for ourselves outside of that system, so that's exactly what he did. He journeyed on his own. He decided to be true to himself, listen to himself, not dismiss his feelings, and basically simply empower himself.
Right. And he's in a lot of pain. I mean, he talks about this need to have his brother and his father in his life, but he also feels that his need to be true to himself trumps that. So it's really an interesting dilemma. And I think what I'm most pleased about is he has blown the lid off of the stigma of sibling estrangement, because if the royals can be struggling with this, we're all there.
Exactly. And there's so many elements that are present with regards to estrangement, The flying monkeys, for example, we were talking about earlier, you and I, before recording, just those elements that are present, just the people that get involved and make things more complicated and enable the system to perpetuate itself, so that's already a problem in and of itself, right?
Right. I mean, it's all on steroids is what it is. He's living in this narcissistic cesspool, and there are flying monkeys in the form of these people who are managing the various factions. So I think it's much worse than anything I could ever even imagine.
Well, exactly. It's on a bigger scale. So, I mean, a lot of us are experiencing this on a smaller scale, but there's still a lot of commonalities that all of us can identify with in terms of what's been experienced. So, I mean, yes, there's the narcissism, there's the flying monkeys. There's, of course, the idea that everything gets brushed under the carpet. Nothing gets discussed. So that's the whole issue also that festers and causes people to experience resentment, of course, right?
Right. And, I did watch The Crown, and I actually thought that was a great series. But what I wanted to mention to you is there is so much manipulation and triangulation. And it's not just in the palace, it's the media. That's a whole other aspect of this. So, what he's dealing with is pretty overwhelming.
It is, and it takes courage to be able to stand up to all of this, and because he knows that he's going to get pushback from the system, and the system is trying to defend itself, is trying to somehow paint him in different ways. Yes, staining him. Yes, exactly. So you can see how there's like a tarnishing of his reputation and all that. So, and people are taking sides, right? Like any classic conflict where we see in some families, it's like there's sides being created, and it's sad when you see this type of situation happen because, I think that he came at this authentically with an authentic need, in wanting to be real with himself, especially too.
Well, I have a couple of comments. One is, I mean, we talked about toxic positivity the last time.
Yep.
The royals are the masters of toxic positivity. Everything is just fine. The other thing is, and we've discussed this a little bit in the past, but there was such a setup for this estrangement. And one of the things that I did read is that there was a lot of bullying that went on. So, for example, William, his brother, and Kate somehow bullied Harry into wearing a Nazi uniform. And of course, he identifies this as one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. And, that kind of bullying often ends up in estrangement. But in addition, there are risk factors, and you can identify some of them for us. And they fall into pretty much every single risk factor.
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of risks that were involved in this in particular. I mean, in terms of, family trauma and things of that nature that they experienced with the loss of their mother and such. There's the whole aspect that we've mentioned in terms of not talking about feelings and such. The idea that people, can't really have a frank one-on-one conversation, right? So there's that, of course, and there's the idea that there's an implied hierarchy, of course, as well, right? It's like you're always made to be less important than someone else in the family. So already, right, what does that say about your sense of self-worth, right? So we see this in families, where there's like an implied hierarchy that is present, and that if you're not on top or you're not amongst the people in power, then, you're subjugated to them, and that's the hard thing. And that's what I suspect fostered some of his torment as well.
Well, parental favoritism is a huge risk factor for estrangement. And you cannot get any more favoritism than one son becoming the king and the other son being the spare.
Yeah, I think that's what happens too. I think that there is the golden child, that narrative that does happen, I think, with that. And it makes it hard because if that golden child starts to throw their weight around and starts to exercise power over other people, then that makes it even worse, because they're indoctrinated and taught that they're more important, therefore they're going to use that. And that doesn't foster healthy relationships with siblings in the long run. if you feel as though you're not equals or you're not accessible to the other person or making room for them in terms of their personality.
So let's talk a little bit about the stigma of sibling estrangement, because I do believe that Harry has single-handedly altered some of that stigma. If I were to tell somebody that I'm divorced, they probably wouldn't even blink an eye. If I tell somebody that I can't get along with my mother, they probably would roll their eyes in agreement. But when I say I can't get along with my brother, there's this arched eyebrow and this suspicion, what's wrong with you?
Exactly. So there's already that stigma that there's somehow you're responsible for the result of what's happened, when in fact we're most oftentimes not responsible for what's happened. We were subject to that. So I think that that's the thing that happens. That plays itself out, just like in the media, like we see how Harry is vilified in some ways, and the whole system like that perpetuates itself. And that's the sad part, is that it perpetuates itself and it's enabled by different elements all around it, you know?
So Harry really may have had no choice. And I've heard from a lot of readers who say things like, I had to protect myself. And yet they are furious and outraged that people shake their finger at them for cutting off from the family. And I fear that Harry's going to have some of this. Clearly, he didn't take the absolute best approach to reconciliation, even though he very much would like a reconciliation. But I think his back was against the wall.
I think that he had to try to do something, and unfortunately, sometimes we have to take drastic measures for ourselves to ensure our survival,
Right.
and that's the thing too. The system is fighting back against him to ensure his survival as well, So,
Right.
Let's talk about what it is that we can do. I think that that's important. Like,
Right.
if they were to actually sit down, and be able to make things better for themselves, Harry and William there, we can get into some of those elements, and I think that one of those elements that's important is the idea of being authentic in acknowledging each other's feelings, especially, first and foremost.
Right. You actually have to sit down face to face without the flying monkeys and actively listen to the other person's story. And the problem is that they're not doing that.
Yeah.
And actually, I've researched quite a bit of information about how to resolve conflict. And one of the ways in which warring sides on a genocide do it, truth and reconciliation, is they have to hear, acknowledge the stories, and also feel the hurts of the other person.
Absolutely. You need to make room for the other person. You need to acknowledge their emotional reality to foster that sense of acknowledgement and understanding. And once that's there, then already you're establishing something of a rapport that's enabling the other person's existence, and that's part of the healing that happens, I think, when it comes to estrangement. Also, it's the acknowledgement, and if you can have that, then great. If you can't, then you have to, of course, find healing through other means. But that's, of course, an important aspect to remember in light of that. And another thing also is perhaps to eliminate the flying monkeys, to not have the whole idea of the telephone game being played, if you will, out with other people around you, right? Because that's another issue that comes up.
And the other thing is I think a lot of times when you sit down face to face, it triggers defensiveness. Well, I did this because you did that. And you have to get out of that. And you have to let go of the anger.
Exactly. I think that if you look at the greater good, you have to look at what it is that you really want. What is the goal here? Is it to salvage the relationship? And if it is, then, to nitpick about each incident and say, okay, who's right, who's wrong here? I mean, if you start to do that, that is another issue altogether, because it does elicit defensiveness, like you say, So I think that that's really, really important to be able to catch that and to recognize what is the greater good, what is the desire for us to move forward when it comes to talking with each other,
Of course, you can't do this alone, and it won't work if only one person has this desire. You have to have both parties desirous of some sort of meeting of minds and reconciliation.
Yes.
And if you don't have it, it's lost. It won't happen.
Yes.
And I think that's probably where Harry ended up. So what he did instead is he wrote a tell-all, which at least he's making money on it.
You know, it's good that he's bringing it out, of course, but of course there's the whole aspect of how do you want to talk about your sibling, you know, of course, because if you bring it out in a tell-all book and you bring up all sorts of different things, then rather than just your feelings and what it's done to you, you know, then what that can do is that can, of course, elicit defensiveness as well, too. So I understand why he did it, you know, it's just the how perhaps could have been done different.
Well, I think he hit rock bottom, and this was his only option in some ways. So, I mean, we'll never know all the details of this because the monarchy keeps everything under wraps. But nonetheless, I am deeply grateful to him for creating a loud megaphone about sibling estrangement. And of course, it's important to remember it cuts across all cultures, all classes. And if the royals are struggling with this, you are not alone.
Exactly. If you see it elsewhere happening in front of you and it's being played out in the media or with other more prominent families, then yes, the message is the same. You are not alone. And I think that's one of the most important messages for us to end on this especially too. So Fern, let's talk about resources. Let's talk about the number one resource you have at this time that you'd like to have our audience know about.
Well, I kept talking about the Sibling Estrangement Journal, but this time I'm going to switch it up and go with Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement, and the Road to Reconciliation, a book that Harry should have read.
It is a wonderful book. It reads very easily and it's very profound. And it presents a lot of the elements associated to estrangement. I completely agree with you. My number one resource is the Improving My Self-Esteem Following Sibling Estrangement workshop. I'm doing that right now, and I'm actually going to be starting another one up fairly soon. So I am taking names for that. And if there's some people that would be interested in joining me on that more intensive experience of journeying towards growth, empowerment, and such, you know, then I certainly think that this can be one of those journeys to take that can foster wellness. So I do think that our audience would benefit greatly from that. So thank you so much for being here, Fern. I really appreciate you being part of this. And it's always great to have this conversation and bring this topic further with regards to our audience. I think this is so pertinent to what all of us are experiencing.
Well, it's great to be with you, and thanks to Harry for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harry, for bringing this conversation to the surface. Take care, Fern.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.